Okay, I'm going to start by introducing our guest, starting from the very end of the table. So we have producer Danny Gabay. Then we have Brian Zacharias, producer, and Hannah Gross, one of the actors. Jeff Goldblum, Rick Halverson, the filmmaker, Tye Sheridan, Sarah Murphy, and Eddie Moretti, producer. I'm going to start with a question to Rick. Rick, you have defined this film an anti-utopian picture. Can you elaborate a little bit?
I think in a general sense, it's we have an excess of utopian narratives in privileged societies, and they're more functional that aspirational model is more functional to deprive populations, and in privileged societies it can become a cancer. And I think we see a lot of that in cinema, and we have for a long time. There's a disproportionate amount of aspirational cinema that doesn't recognize limitations and boundaries, and limitations and boundaries are the substance of form and necessary for responsible living, and I think the film operates in that vein.
And Jeff, do you have something to add to this? Because we were just discussing in the back room. Can you?
Well, I do. Yes, I do. Thank you. Well, I'm interested in what Rick says. I have the utmost respect for Rick Halverson. I think you're a genius, as you know. I think it's a brilliant movie, and it's so poetical. But I'm a meat and potatoes kind of idiot, so I love to know what we're talking about here. I myself am trying to answer that question while I was preparing for it and while I was doing it, and since I've seen it and knowing that I was maybe going to talk about it, I've been thinking more about it. For me, in alignment with what you said, it's so rich for me, but I do love the ideas of the particularly human, but even more particularly American utopian dream in its misguided elements, as Arthur Miller wrote about in Death of a Salesman, when a culture grabs too much and is too ambitious for notoriety, attention, glamour, empty glamour, and diluted fantasy in too much proportion. We've seen how that can go very badly. And in this movie, we see that, even as it arises from the medical profession, one of the most barbaric mistakes with the lobotomy cycle and episode is depicted, and the American quick fix and narcissistic need for attention and assembly line solutions of an unnatural and inorganic kind, and not exactly factual-based kind. And then, as it overlaps with the victims of deluded fantasy in the realms of spiritual aspiration, and in the particularly American variation of that, as it's cropped up so abundantly since its inception. And in the 50s, in this New Age version, I'm provoked and inflamed by all of that. I think they're important subjects to me and to us, I dare say. And so in the coming days, I'd love to talk more and hear more about those things.
Buongiorno, sono Roberto Sapienza di Parola Colori. Buongiorno, sono Roberto Sapienza di Parola Colori. Vuoi chiedere la signora Franza? tema della psichiatria, della lobotomizzazione, vorrei se è un tema che lei conosceva, approfondito, perché è molto curato, sulle scene dei manicomi, come avveniva la lobotomizzazione. Vorrei sapere se è un interesse che lei aveva negli anni, appunto se ha studiato per questo film, gli stessi attori quanto conoscevano di questa realtà e come è stato complicato calarsi in questi ruoli e renderli così credibili i malati. E poi il tema della solitudine, quello che un parere vostro sulla solitudine del malato psichiatrico è quello che vive apparentemente la persona normale. Grazie.
It's coming, just 1 second.
Yeah. So regarding the lobotomy, the character of Dr. Fiennes in the film is very loosely based on the historical figure, Dr. Walter Freeman, who invented the lobotomy based on the European procedure called leucotomy, and ultimately disposed even of his surgeon and found a way to perform the intervention without that kind of expertise. And it was sort of in 1954, in that pocket, it kind of fell from grace as Thorazine and other drugs came on the market, and people began to scrutinize the procedure more. For me, that is, it was indicative of a very particular American male ambition that moves, lunges unbridled into a future, and without considering the ramifications, even adamantly blind to those ramifications. And there were a lot in the case of the lobotomy.
I think that he was asking also for the actors to explain how much they look into what the procedures were like in the world of mental health at the time.
I did, yeah. I played this character based on Walter Freeman. I've been aware of lobotomy as it's been depicted in, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Francis and a couple of things like that kind of gripped me. But no, it wasn't until researching this movie where I'm nothing if not conscientious. So we got together. I was not aware of the name Walter Freeman, but read much about him. There's a documentary or two about him that I looked at, and he told me everything that he'd researched. And our character, even though our movie, it's not a literal depiction of him. It's a springboard that takes off from him, but I wanted to know as much as I could about lobotomy as we were going to, recreate the procedure. And he's a very interesting and American character. He had a grandfather who was a famous surgeon in the Civil War, and his father was a very successful doctor. So he suffered from this need to make something of himself and wanted to make his mark conspicuously in one way or another, and latched onto this thing. He found this man from Portugal who finally won the Nobel Prize for lobotomy, Moniz, and he thought, I could do this in America. And from what I gather, there was an Italian who had this idea of going in through the eyeball, and he adopted that method and then called it one thing or another. Anyway, he went on to what he thought of as curing homosexuality. 40% of the people, from what I gather and read, were homosexuals that he thought he could cure by doing that. He did it to housewives who he thought to be mollified and more domesticated. He did it to people as young as 4 years old. It was a monstrous, mistaken kind of phenomenon, but we read and were provoked about all of that, and that informed our fevered attempt to depict it.
I think Anna's perspective, if you can hear me, it would be interesting at this point, because as women were often victim of this kind of procedure, and the character you play, she has no apparent illness sedate her spirit. So can you tell us what the thing for the film was for you?
Well, you see.
For Hannah, yeah.
Yes, actually I had a friend whose grandmother was lobotomized in the 70s in Arkansas, which was one of the last states to ban lobotomies. And so I was asking her what her grandmother was like, and this woman was, she was one of the more successful cases where she was fully functional, could speak, but was completely docile and would have this creepy effect of repeating things. Like she said that every time that her siblings were born, her grandmother would come over and hold the baby and say, "Oh, sweet, sweet baby." I don't know why I'm telling you this. But in terms from my character's perspective, yeah, it was absolutely not uncommon for any husband, father, the Kennedys who wanted to have a more docile daughter or wife would order a lobotomy for them. But I think Susan was interesting because it was not entirely against her will. She went into the procedure knowing full well what would happen. And it was I think she had sort of not exactly a death wish desire for it, but certainly she just wanted to exist on a different plane. Because she was already institutionalized by her father numerous times. It's the 1950s in Washington State, in a small town. There's not a lot of options for someone who has their brain on fire.
As a viewer and a producer of this film, I would love you and Jeff to talk about that scene where you do get lobotomized, because as a viewer, it's the most intense, one of the most intense parts of the film, because you don't want Susan to submit to that procedure, and you definitely want Tye to do something heroic at that moment. And I guess, Jeff, Rick, you're not going to allow them to be heroic or make the right decision. It's such a brutal moment in the film, and it's so powerful. That's where the popcorn's going to get thrown at the screen, I think. Or not.
What?
Well, that's where the popcorn's going to get thrown at the screen when Susan's lobotomized. So how was it just being directed in that sequence for you guys?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate, by the way, if you missed it, that Walter Freeman was the guy also who lobotomized.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I want to reiterate what she alluded to, that Walter Freeman was the guy who lobotomized Rosemary Kennedy, JFK's sister. You can read much about that. I'm so interested in what you were saying, and I'm so thrilled by your character. It's so stunning and what you've got going on. And it occurs to me as you were talking that, like I was trying to talk about, your character, it seems to me, I wonder how you feel, is overlapped by both things. Of course, there's submissiveness caused by your father that causes you to be less than heroic at that moment, or maybe not unheroic, but anyway, beaten down. But your father, you've already had this, and you seem to be, although obliquely and ambiguously, beautifully ambiguously, in thrall to his ways and his teaching, so that maybe I don't know what you're thinking about it, is that you're already susceptible to another man who wants to impose something that will change your state. Is that true, I wonder? And then I'll talk about what I was thinking about in that scene.
No. I don't think so. No, I think actually to go back to the theme of what this movie's about and why it is important, I think one of the most important film I've ever been a part of. is because I sort of decided to see Susan as the only person who knows what's going on in the film. And knowing what is happening, I mean, even the concept of the ineffable has been corrupted by her father. So what do you do when there's just no answers anywhere? You, rather than kill yourself, you just go deeper inside your body, which is what a lot of did.
So interesting. Yeah, in that scene, I was, let's see what happened. Well, by that time, it's an interesting moment, of course, because I'm about to lobotomize her on the kitchen table, on the dining room table, which is a come down for me personally. I've been just kicked out of the institution, so I can't do it in the real place anymore. I got to go to people's houses for heaven's sake, and do this thing. So I'm unhappy about that. And then I hear, and then this crazy guy, what am I to make of that crazy guy played by the wonderful Denis Lavant? I'm in his house, and he's radiating something that I would sense, and we're communing in a second. Then I go over, feeling something going on down the hall, and see my dear cohort losing his virginity to the patient about to be lobotomized. For heaven's sake.
That's a no-no, right?
Well, it's so rich. I mean, it's so rich. And then I happen upon it and then have to lobotomize her. Oh, my God. Well, I think as in every other moment of this movie, there's 1,000 things going on under the surface. And that's why I find it edge of the seat making and riveting and breathtaking and provocative. You know?
I have a question for Rick. Rick, in your previous film, in all your films, you refuse to give the audience easy empathy with your characters. In this film, it's a little more of a fine line, because even the doctor has some fun, emotionally approachable moments, and Tye obviously is a character that leads herself closer to empathy. Can you describe how you opened up a little bit the characters to the audience, and also what kind of relation you want to establish between the viewer and your characters?
I mean, I kind of am developing a very strong sort of feeling that our surplus of sympathetic characters that meet our particular demographic standards engineer sort of bigotry in the world. There's a lot of that. We have access, there are surrogates, there are avatars, we explore vicarious worlds through these characters. They give us perfect access, it's unimpeded, and usually they match our sex, race, gender, ideologies. There's some way for us to, that's what how sympathy sort of in cinema sort of operates on those, by those rules. And then we walk out into the streets and we just look for those surrogates, and we're unaccustomed to otherness in a way that we don't exercise. That sort of contention with the flat, sort of strange, unavailable people and objects in the world. I think that cinema has a lot of blood on its hands for that.
Tye, how do you go from Ready Player One to a role like this? I mean, what's your thought process?
Well, I've worked with Rick once more. I've always admired his bravery in his filmmaking and his narrative craft, I think. Especially thematically, like these movies that Rick makes. I mean, they're not super easy to grasp in a good way. It kind of, I think especially this film, it really disrupts your typical experience of watching a movie and what you're accustomed to seeing. I think that's a lot of what this movie is about, and not to, I'm not trying to escape from any thematical explanation by saying that. I think that in this movie, the idea of the lobotomy as a bigger metaphor in the movie is, you see this character, Jeff Goldblum's character, who's, going, he's kind of taking advantage of people in mid-century America.
who believe that their mental illness or, you know, their struggle with their sexuality or whatever it is can be cured by, you know, some operation on the brain. And really, you know, he's taking advantage of that, I think, in the same way that, you know, so many people in the world take advantage of the mass public. And so it's a really interesting idea that kind of, I think, provokes and challenges the way that we all live in this world and, you know, the movies and the content and the media that we're all kind of influenced and consumed by.
Sì, salve. Io volevo sapere se volevo qualche commento sullo stile del film, che è particolare e originalissimo. Quindi volevo capire che tipo di scelte sono state fatte, che riferimenti iconografici ci sono e perché si è deciso di fare un film, insomma, con questi colori, queste inquadrature, queste cornici, e, insomma, delle scelte stilistiche molto precise. Grazie.
I mean, the movie's hyper formal, and you know, almost to a fault, and that's intentional. And Lorenzo Hagerman, my director of photography, and I talked a lot about that, and you know, it was meant to resemble you know, still lifes, and you know, touched on a lot of 20th century cinema, and I think in the 4:3 aspect ratio is, I mean, it's all in some degree an obstruction, and I even think it could be excruciatingly formal, and I hope that happens actually. You know, for some reason, pillar box 4:3 feels restricted to us, and you know, like the blacks on our laptop screens and our television are obstruction, but when you put them horizontally, it's cinema and it has access, you know. I love the idea that we would feel that there's an obstruction, that we would have to contend with the material of the thing, the form. We're such a content-driven society, increasingly, that we just move straight through the form. We're conditioned not even to give it a second thought. We're blind to it. We're increasingly ignorant to the materials and the makeup of the world around us. And so I hope that experience is something that people have to contend with. The narrative isn't easily digestible intentionally. There's a lot in it. It's difficult. It's not quickly consumable. I hope that it would sit with people for a week and that they would struggle with it and maybe even find it you know, impossible for a moment, but that it was enough of you know, that they have to contend with it. That it's then that sort of obstruction is constructive.
I'm Kerstin from Stockholm. I wondered if, I have two questions. One, was there any living character like Tye Sheridan's part was based on? Did you have an assistant? Was there a photographer, or was the photographer in all?
Historically, Freeman did all his own photos. He was obsessed with cameras and that sort of thing. So Tye's character is a fictional take on the classic sort of male model of the coming of age, and you know, that sort of and that there's some sort of fruition and some attainment through, you know, loss of virginity and in the world of union with you know, in a heteronormative sense. So I mean, this character is totally on that, you know, in that mode, on that path, and I think that a lot of the film and what tension there is in it narratively is consistent with his struggle to, you know, conform to that easily.
Yeah, I think as much as he represents that symbol, it's kind of, I think he's kind of facing it openly and, you know, contemplating, you know, some of the ideas that are the ideology that we live behind or live in shadow of as far as, like, you know, I think a lot of this movie is about, I think we kind of just touched on it now, but a lot of the movies about, you know, male supremacy and, you know, these, and gender in general, really, and how we identify with our own sex and who we are, who people tell us to be, and, you know, sometimes
you know, the idea of a great man or the idea of, you know, what a man should be and should act like is not always maybe what you feel inside, or sometimes has some flaw to it and may not be the right prescription for everyone. So it's kind of, I think that for me, that was the most kind of interesting thing to explore with this character as well. I fell in love with it the first time I read it, and again, you know, I just admiring Rick's bravery to go outside the box, because it's not a conventional take on you know, you don't often see a character that's kind of I guess you'd call him the protagonist in the film, who's this silent, who's this subtle and open to just experiencing the movie in parallel with you, the audience.
Is everything scripted, or is there some improvisation or something, especially with the Goldblum and
Dialogue scripted. Of course, you know, there's always elasticity, you know, and the thing comes alive, and there's, you know, in that term, you know, there's always room for improvisation, and we utilize it to that degree, but largely scripted.
Okay, last question, because they're calling me for time, so we have one here.
A question for Tye Sheridan and Jeff Goldblum. What hit you the most during the movie? What thematically did you the most?
Thematically, what?
About your character.
Sorry, what's
Yeah,
this?
what was the most interesting part about your character?
Most interesting part of
Yeah, what thematically, what you felt close to?
Well, I kind of just spoke about it. You know, it's just I think the struggle and contemplation of identity and gender, and I don't know, I think the film really explores a lot of themes, and all of them are really great from my character specifically. I think he's just a vehicle for all of that. I mean, I don't know if I have much anything interesting to say outside of what I used to say.
Everything you say is interesting.
Likewise, Jeff Goldblum.
Me? You know, it was interesting when I first read it, when I was working, preparing for it, when we were doing it, up until the last shooting day, I was interested and wildly interested and in love with Rick and the whole process and this character. You know, I think the whole thing is an indictment of patriarchal, conventional maleness. Well, you may have an idea, Sarah Murphy, about that. I love that idea. Did it from scene to scene and take to take how much my character needed to, like Willie Loman or the character, or Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, The Master, or Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood, or some of the characters in Altman's Nashville that I was part of in 1973, how much they needed to, were in the death throes of this protection of their old ways, and how much they were self-aware and realized the damage that they were doing to a sweet, live boy and live girl and women around me, and how much regret and pain I had to face with what I was doing, and how much guilt I had about it. Like that.
I'm so sorry, but they called me twice, so we